Once I reach 1,000 subscribers, I will always have a live chat on the first Friday of the month at 8 p.m. So please subscribe, click on the bell, and let's get 1,000 subscribers very soon. Gudde Moien and welcome back to Planet Althistory. Today we are going to discuss what if the Cold War never ended. The Cold War, or the rivalry between West and East, is seen as the result of the outcome of World War II. The West and the East occupied parts of Germany and created alliances and transformed other countries to make them more akin to their system. All of Western Europe came under the influence of the US, and most of Central and all of Eastern Europe under the influence of the USSR. Due to many interventions and also bad economy, the USSR was somehow destined to fail. Afghanistan was their downfall. Until today, we still see the results of this intervention. Because after the USSR went there, the US had of course to support the anti-communists, which happened to be, well, you know the story. I suppose. Anyways. Afghanistan was not only the problem of the East, and later on it became also the problem of the West. There was also the mismanagement of the economy, and due to the fact that Ronald Reagan accelerated military spendings, the Soviet Union needed to somehow do the same to catch up, otherwise they would show signs of weaknesses. But hey, let's change this scenario. So what if the Soviet Union never went to Afghanistan? What if the Soviet Union could catch up to the US? And what if the Cold War never ended? For the sake of the scenario, we are not going to discuss any part where the Cold War becomes a warm or hot war. There will also be not a nuclear war happening. So that's not the point of this scenario. The point of this scenario is to discuss the implications of a longer Cold War. A Cold War that perhaps will never end until today in ATL. First, we need to change the situation in Afghanistan a little bit. So maybe you are aware that Afghanistan until 1973 was a kingdom, a monarchy. And the king, he will still make the visits overseas, and he would not stay in Afghanistan as in OTL. Mohammed Daoud Khan would still depose his cousin, King Mohammed Zahir Shah, and the Zhao revolution in 1978 would still happen. So these are things that I will not change, but this thing will be something that is kinda a minor detail that is very often forgotten. Instead of having a Soviet intervention, and if we look at the map, the Soviet Union was bordering Afghanistan, we can also still see that on the other side there was China. So what if instead of a Soviet intervention there would be a Chinese Maoist intervention? And why would this be? My reason for this is the following. The People's Democratic Party of Afghanistan, or let's say Communist Party, they killed and arrested everyone who was a Maoist. So Maoists, they had a very bad time in Afghanistan. Moreover, nobody really wanted to work with the Maoists in OTL. And here is where China comes into the play. Why? First of all, Hua Guofeng, the successor to Mao, faces troubles to impose himself as a leader. He is largely forgotten nowadays. He is known as the most loyal Maoist, and if the Afghan Maoists would somehow convince him to intervene in Afghanistan, he would probably be helping those that are Maoists in Afghanistan, of course. And Hua Guofeng would probably try to say that it was China's duty to protect the ideas of Mao, or to protect the legacy of Mao, which would be attacked if other Maoists close to China in Afghanistan would be attacked and persecuted. And another thing is that Hua Guofeng would make a gamble, a political gamble for power, which happened many times in OTL with other leaders. And he might think if he's successful with the intervention, he would gain more popularity, more support, and he could impose himself within the Communist Party in China. Moreover, in OTL, and this is a known fact, the Chinese, they trained the Mujahideens, and China was an important transfer point for American weapons and aid. So, if we try to needle in every point by point into something bigger, into a bigger network, then it might be a very likely alternate scenario, an alternate point of divergence. So this means that the Soviet Union will not go to Afghanistan. The Soviets would realize that it could turn into a direct conflict with China, and they would declare the Communist Party of Afghanistan as a Trotskyist or revisionist party. There's less money spent in a foreign intervention, although this will not magically solve other problems that the Soviet Union has. They will still, of course, support other communist groups around the globe. But it will give them some room for improvements. 70s and also the 80s with Brezhnev, they were not really known to be very progressive in terms of economical growth. And now we have China in a deep trouble. We have the US as well, who will send a lot of money, guns, weapons, and so on, to rather support someone that the Chinese prefer to have than someone that the Soviets would prefer to have. Because think of it, Nixon, he went still in a time where Mao was alive, and this was also important because Mao, he broke relations with Khrushchev, and thus the US would see China as, maybe not as an ally of course, but they would see China as a partner. Reagan, if he still becomes a president, he can't spend more money on an arms race throughout the 80s. And the US as well as China will have a slower development. Because as we know, Afghanistan eats a lot of money away. The USSR will also at the same time have to stop funding communism throughout Africa, for instance, and they would repurpose these resources into keeping the Eastern Bloc alive, because the Eastern Bloc, they were having a lot of problems, rebellions, and thus the Soviets would have to make a choice, and they would rather focus to have their little satellites close to them still being communist than trying to change without maybe much of a success other countries into communist country that are more far away and not so close to them. The rebellions, the revolts, they will be remembered in a similar way as the Spring of Prague or the East German uprising of 1953. Of course, there will be a lot of condemnation because they would use brutal force, but that's unfortunately how it would be in this alternate scenario. The next thing that happens is the Soviet Union definitely has to make some reforms, and they would not have similar reforms as Gorbachev's, but they would have reforms more close to China, as in OTL. This would be economical reforms. It would probably go a bit faster in terms of infrastructure and spread due to the fact that the trade partners would rather be limited. and it would take roughly the same time or amount of time as China in OTL. Yugoslavia at the end will not really collapse, but they will be having a good help by the Soviets, who would send some support to the Yugoslav leadership, and later on the Yugoslav leadership and the Soviet leadership, they would agree that it's possible to have different interpretations of socialism. Now, of course, this would open a Pandora box, and the Soviets would let their satellite states experiment with some different forms of socialism. However, as long as they would stay loyal allies in the political and in economic terms, the Soviet Union would not try to somehow do anything in there. After being unsuccessful in Afghanistan, the Chinese would reorientate themselves and try to make an approachment with the Soviets, seeing how they accepted now different interpretations of socialism. Afghanistan will have a closer relation with Iran and probably with other states that are more supportive of Islamism. Terrorism would in this alternate timeline arise in Turkestan, Western China, and in the USSR, Chechnya. The US would get involved in Iraq after Hussein would invade Kuwait as in OTL. The Americans would stay in Iraq in this timeline as the Islamists were more powerful than in OTL. As the Islamists were closer with Iran, the US would not support them in this scenario because they would fear to alienate the Saudis, who were a very good ally of them, and a temporary smaller assistance would be given to the Soviets and the Chinese, easing the tense relations that the US has with the East. The US would recognize that it is better to have an enemy such as the Soviets, an enemy you can easily locate, you know who it is and you know where to find them, whereas Islamists in this timeline would even be more unpredictable, more spread, and they would be closer to Iran, which the US, of course, would not really like, for obvious reasons. It is also very likely that the Soviets and the Americans might continue their space race and do a joint mission. Pop culture would be very different. Sure, the Soviets and communism are still seen in a negative light, but this rivalry would mature somewhat and progress would be made to ensure that peace throughout the globe exists and prevails. The US would be less interventionist and not see themselves in a role as the world police, but rather see themselves with the Soviets as the police in their own sphere of influence. And there would still be exchange, especially in the domain of science, and exchange of information in regards of counterterrorism. However, if for one reason or another the US or the USSR get more aggressive during the 90s, we might see more proxy wars in Latin America. And there especially Peru would come into my mind, with the terrorist group that was later on defeated by the Fujimoris. And we have, of course, Colombia, and very important, Venezuela. The space race would accelerate, and goals of having a successful manned mission in Mars or Venus would be more likely than in OTL, and Antarctica as well as the North Pole would be more militarized. Now, also in this part of the scenario where the US or the USSR get more aggressive, the Islamists, they would still be approached by the US, but would it backfire even harder in this scenario? That's it for today. I hope you enjoyed my video. Be sure to like and subscribe, leave a comment, support me also on Patreon, and join my forum, forum.planetalthistory.ga. Until next time on Planet Althistory.